Argument number 4, patterns in word choice. We're going to break this one down into 2 categories. First is arguments from the perceived intent of the gospel writer, and second, arguments from borrowed words. The first of these 2 isn't going to get us very far, because in the past century plus, the overwhelming majority of studies that have endeavored to ascertain the intent the gospel writer had have presupposed Markan priority. That is, in saying that Mark's intent was X and Matthew's intent was Y, they already assumed Markan priority in order to get to that point. An argument that takes Markan priority as a premise cannot be used to prove Markan priority as a conclusion. Indeed, we find that both Markan and Matthean prioritists have had no trouble in positing plausible intents of the author that align with their own personal views. Thus, the plethora of papers suggesting, based on the intent of the author, we think Mark wrote first, is a reflection rather than a cause of the popularity of Markan priority. We'll spend a little bit more time on the argument from borrowed words. This is where scholars have found that writers have a literary fingerprint, calling cards, favorite words and phrases that are helpful in identifying their work. When this is studied scientifically, it's known as stylometry, and where sufficient data is available, it has been used to identify the author of anonymous documents. In the context of the Gospels, various scholars have put together lists of what appear to be favorite words and phrases of each Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They can then look for these words and phrases in the other Gospels in the right contexts in order to make a case for plausible borrowing. One of the most popular examples of this phenomenon is Mark's use of the word immediately. Mark likes this word. He uses it a lot. Matthew less so. In fact, in every case, save one exception, where Matthew uses a form of the word immediately, there's a parallel in Mark. This is interesting, that in the portions of Matthew that overlap with Mark, the word immediately shows up a fair amount, but in the portions of Matthew that do not overlap with Mark, Matthew seldom uses the word. On Markan priority, this is explicable by saying that Matthew didn't often choose this word on his own, but if he saw it in his source, sometimes he would go ahead and copy it. I submit that this argument is not compelling. As we noted earlier, Mark is the action-oriented gospel. You would expect a word like immediately to show up more frequently in describing what people were doing than in the context of long sermons. And it is the portions of Matthew and Mark that overlap that lean heavily towards what people were doing, whereas the portions of Matthew that are not in Mark lean much more heavily towards the long sermons. This evidence then is not surprising, that Matthew would use the word immediately more in the doing portion of his gospel than in the saying portions. So I don't find this to be a particularly persuasive case for Markan priority. It could be explained with either Matthew copying Mark or Mark copying Matthew. Furthermore, if Matthew is using the word immediately because he's copying it from Mark, we have a consistency problem on the part of Matthew. You see, Mark is consistent in his spelling of immediately in Greek. Matthew's not. He uses 2 different spellings. If Matthew's just using this word because he sees it in Mark and he's copying it, then why does he sometimes use Mark's spelling and sometimes mix it up? This inconsistency would be at odds with the claim by many who propose Markan priority that it is Matthew's consistent and cohesive writing style that suggests that he was written later and he's copying from Mark. This is a case where we find arguments for Markan priority playing both sides of the net. On the one hand, we're told that it is the author who uses the word more consistently who wrote first, and the author who uses the word less consistently that wrote second. On the other hand, we're told to expect that the author who wrote second is refining and standardizing the less consistent and more unusual writing of the first. Which is it? Is Mark the more consistent or less consistent writer? Either way, it is the arguments for Markan priority that are inconsistent. Another shortcoming of the argument from borrowed words, in general, is that it's reversible. We can find evidence going the other way. Some of the favorite Matthean phrases include things like, when even was come, or son of David, and we see Mark using them in the right context to suggest on this argument that Mark copied them from Matthew. With evidence pointing in multiple directions, a number of scholars have sought to mathematically evaluate where is the evidence stronger. They've produced a variety of results. David Barrett Peabody has noted that the vast majority of these studies have either implicitly or explicitly presupposed Markan priority. In comparing the Gospels and coming up with the lists of words, they've already assumed that Mark wrote first. If Markan priority is one of our assumptions, then it should come as no surprise that the study produces results that are consistent with the assumptions by which it was constrained. A notable exception to this presupposition error is the work of Edward Zeller. In 1843, Zeller published his own efforts to mathematically evaluate who is more likely to be borrowing from whom, and he didn't presuppose which gospel was written first. Zeller indeed found that the evidence points in multiple directions, but the weight of the evidence did not. He found it was much more likely, there was far more evidence that Mark was borrowing from Matthew than the other way around. There was also far more evidence that Mark was borrowing from Luke than the other way around. Between Matthew and Luke themselves, the evidence was less one-sided. In effect, in Zeller's data, for every example we can cite where it looks like Matthew borrowed this word from Mark, there are 2 examples going the other way. There's twice the evidence that it was Mark who borrowed from Matthew. Zeller's data come out strongly against the view that Mark was written first. The data suggests that Mark was written third. And what are we to make of the data pointing in multiple directions? I think we have to allow that it's at least possible that 2 authors could independently use the same word, but where this happens over and over again, it's more challenging to appeal to coincidence. Prominent New Testament scholar Theodor von Zahn in the early 20th century proposed a clever hypothesis. He suggested that Matthew was written first in a Semitic language. Mark, written later in Greek, used Matthew as a source, and when Matthew was even later translated into Greek, the translator referenced the Greek of Mark. Thus Matthew influenced Mark, and Mark influenced Matthew. This is an interesting theory. In a later segment in this series, we'll explore it in greater depth and expand upon it. To summarize then, the argument from patterns in word choice, what we find is far too often they fall prey to presupposing the conclusion they're trying to prove. And even when they don't, the arguments are reversible. Because the evidence points in multiple directions, people can find evidence in patterns in word choice to support whatever assumptions they started with.